Michelle. This is it's really it's a great honor. I mean, I think, as you mentioned, I think Sue may have had something to do with me being here now. I know you helped a lot, Deanne, with the logistics, and of course SER, where you're proud of your 10 years of engagement. I just was doing the math, and I had to count on my fingers 40 years of going to SER meetings. So it is it's very nice to be a part of anything that honestly that they're involved with and that they're supporting. Let me just also say too that again, it's exciting to be in the forefront in a new program, a new enterprise like this, because you kind of get to invent it as you go. My first job, you mentioned, was the University of Colorado. It was this small department of preventive medicine. It had about a 35-year gestation period before it became a school of public health. You've been hopefully on a faster time course than that. And Brown also is a very new school of public health. And there really is a very distinctive and exciting niche to being a part of that. There's a certain energy that comes that is very hard to sustain when you wait until you're 50 years old, not you individually, although that's another issue, but wait until the school is 50 years old and see if to maintain some of that same kind of spark and enthusiasm that's there now. So, at any rate, I will something that let me make sure. Okay. This is a topic that as I've become increasingly interested in. As Michelle mentioned, it sounds like I have no career focus at all. There are themes within it, but it's as you go to these different areas, there are commonalities, and I think that one of the least effectively addressed limitations of epidemiology is in the optimal use of what we do know. Now that's sort of, I recognize there's a pipeline of knowledge from the very basic discoveries to the intervention programs and so on, but I've become really quite interested in that interface between where the research leaves off and how it is interpreted and used, both in terms of setting policy. If you want to know how fragmented it is, just I'm sure as those of you in the field, you'll have friends saying, I read this article about this. What's going on with that? Is this something that's a big deal? Should I be worried about it? And I think that it's really a very sort of a limiting factor in the field, and I'm not saying this is any sort of magic solution to it, but at least in the talk and in especially the revised version of the book, which Michelle mentioned just came out, we're really trying to come to grips with that and communicate on that interface where epidemiology leaves off and the real world begins, if you will. So, as I think about it and reflect on my training and the field in general, this is not a substitute for really grappling with the complexities of epidemiologic methods. That's got to be there. That's part of what is required to do epidemiology and to make sense of epidemiology. Also, the subject matter expertise, a deep subject matter expertise that often involves working with collaborators in medicine, in physical sciences, in statistics, in other areas. Both those are necessary but not sufficient. And I think that the challenge is to integrate the methodologic understanding, substantive knowledge, and then be able to communicate that and use that in the ways that are most appropriate. And that's really what I'll be talking about. So this is sort of a preview of the themes that I will be going through. What I see at least as some of the challenges in doing this well. I've got a couple of case studies, and I'll try to keep the time manageable in them, and they're very different ones, but areas I've had some involvement with directly or indirectly. One, a study of environmental exposures, cell phones and brain cancer. Another one on caffeine and miscarriage. Very different, intentionally very different topics. What do we learn from going through those examples in some detail? And what do at least I think might be helpful to continue to advance the value and impact of epidemiologic research? So again, this is a whirlwind tour of decades of work, but the epidemiologic methods, when I was first getting into the field in the 1980s, there was this infusion of more sophisticated statistical thinking of the idea of, wow, logistic regression, that's a nice concept, maybe there's something useful there, and it was literally at that level of distinguishing between confounding and effect modification, very basic sort of understanding, dealing with misclassification in a quantitative way.
And of course, that evolved then into sort of, it goes, I mean, they go in parallel, but then this more theoretical understanding of what does it mean to have multiple factors contributing to disease, counterfactual examination of confounding exchangeability. And so there's this sort of these threads that have evolved over decades. And I think really of late, causal inference has become a real unifying theme for the design interpretation of epidemiologic studies. I won't go through these technical sort of dimensions to it, but it's really acknowledging that except for pure descriptive epidemiology, except for just counting things and documenting things, if we are going to use epidemiology to change the world beneficially, we may or may not like it, but we are making causal inferences. When you infer that an intervention will have an impact, that's a causal effect, and we're trying to do our best to use the evidence we have to make an informed judgment about that causal effect. So that's the nature of the exercise of analytic epidemiology. I think that, as I said, I think it's been relatively more limited progress in sort of refining the ways that we assess the meaning and value of epidemiologic evidence. I think that it's been very difficult. You know, it's interesting. It's almost like different parts of your brain where I've been in all parts of the field where you're dealing with the technical, deep methods, you're dealing with the subject matter, and then the people, you know, someone at you know, your friend asks you, well, what's going on with this? And they almost seem disconnected. It's almost, wait, one thing, they don't seem to have a lot to do with each other, even though, of course, they should. And that sort of fragmentation of our thinking about it, I think, does a disservice. You know, again, the message for policymakers is often one of caution, which is in many cases appropriate, but it really doesn't help to use all those years of expertise and say the evidence is inconclusive. That is not, you know, it's always true. It's inherently true, not terribly helpful, and really I'm trying to go well beyond that sort of assessment. As I said, they're often separated. I do some counterexamples there. There's certain fields where they're really those who are more biologically and clinically sophisticated have connected with those who are more methodologically sophisticated. HIV treatment is a good example. But really, the separation of methodologists from practitioners is unhealthy. It's not serving the needs of public health very well, and I think even it can create sort of this, if you will, now I use the political term they seem to like in it, but this sort of echo chamber of methodologists debating with each other. And I'm saying that may need to go on behind the scenes, but at some point it needs to emerge and affect what the rest of us do. So that's what I'm looking for. And really, another theme in what I'm talking about is also that you need to have a sufficient familiarity with the menu of methodologic tools. That's what courses do. That's what training does in graduate school. But then you need to sort of know when to invoke which ones for what purpose. And I think that can be a bit of a challenge as well. I think that, you know, with epidemiology, this recognition of the potential for error can lead to excessive caution. And I think there's a bit of a reluctance to commit and say, well, this is really, you know, quite plausible. This is probably unlikely. It doesn't necessarily help to say the current knowledge is somewhere between 0 and 100% certainty. We need to do better than that. And again, it's arbitrary, of course, to quantify it, but it's quite different if it's 20% likely or 80% likely or 50% likely. And I think that it's trying to use that kind of thinking to have the information be used more optimally. In epidemiology, and as I was discussing before the talk, and really across all fields, in my role as Vice President for Research, I'm talking to economists and physicists and mathematicians and people from all over the university. And there is a really universal pull now towards having research have meaning and impact. And so when you submit a grant application to NIH in the old days, of course, there was a concern with, is it an interesting topic, is it important, and so on. But oh, if the methods are elegant enough, it was almost be, that's okay, we'll do it anyway. It's just so neat, it's so clever. Now the very first question, and it's really the hurdle, is so what? What is the potential impact of this? Remember, this is going all the way back to my undergraduate thesis advisor, but I'm sure it wasn't original even for him. If it's not worth doing, it's not worth doing well. And it is absolutely the case that elegant methods, if you don't make the case that there is impact of the research, you're not going to be able to, it's just not going to get very far in submitting grants. But also I think that the desire is for doing research which will have bearing on the admittedly tentative conclusions. It will shift the evidence, even if it remains in an uncertain range, but it will make a significant impact that people will act on and need to know. It won't be so subtle or nuanced that nobody, you're tweaking it in a narrow enough range that it doesn't even matter. You're trying to move it across levels in a way that will have real and more meaningful impact. I think also another sort of sub-theme to that, the last point on the slide, increasingly, and this is a good thing for epidemiology, people want to use it from all different fields. They use it in court. They use it obviously for setting policy. People want to use it in planning their lives and in figuring out what to feed their kids. There's a whole hunger there for trying to use this information, and that by definition pushes us into the so what part of the story. So this is the ideal, the goal of for those who are interpreting epidemiologic evidence, like us and others. We would like to make the full and objective use of all relevant information. We will bring to bear an understanding of methods so that we can scrutinize the empirical data and make a methodologically informed assessment of the quality of that evidence. And then at the end of that, we will communicate that in a way that actually helps people. And I'll come back to this at the end. But there are varying versions of the story that you would give to a fellow epidemiologist. And it's not that it's different in character, but it may be quite different in tone from the way you would explain it to a friend who doesn't know anything about epidemiology, or to a policymaker, or to a politician. And it's trying to acknowledge that part of this interpretation does involve the communication that way. Now, this is just a schematic of what I'm going to go through in the next 5 slides, because each bullet point I'm going to be talking a bit more about. But in suggesting a logical sequence or flow through when you're asked the question about what does this research mean and what do we know about this topic, or even what does this study as a single study say. And the first point is to describe the causal hypothesis in detail. Given that hypothesis, how close do the methods approximate a test or an examination of it? Because very often there's a deviation, and that's the nature of what biases are, in fact, in many ways. Identifying the major sources of error where you may have gone wrong, integrating all these pieces of the puzzle, and then interpreting and providing guidance based on that. So when I talk about a causal hypothesis in detail, not just enough to say, I think this exposure has something to do with this disease. That's not terribly helpful. Although it's often implicitly what we're doing, to be honest, because then it gives us a free range that anything we pick up on fits. Not to be too cynical about it, but it's easy to find something if you say, is there something about this in some way, analyzed in some capacity, that will suggest something is going on, and then you grab a hold of the something going on and you publish a paper and so on. I think that in reality, we would do well to be much more specific exactly what kind of exposure and which disease and what form of the disease are we talking about. What's the temporal course that we think connects the exposure to the disease? Not in fine detail necessarily, but there's got to be a thought to the general mechanism that's involved, because that really that isn't just sort of biologic information that's on the side, but it really helps to shape the nature of the first 2 questions. If we don't have any idea about mechanism, well, is it going to cause the disease to pop up in an hour or in 20 years? Is it cumulative dose? Is it the peak exposure? All of that is predicated at least on a general understanding of what the mechanism's likely to be. Once that's been laid out, it sets the benchmark then for how effectively we've been able to address it when we do the study. How well have we been able to zero in on it? And then once we look at the results, we can examine the profile of results. And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't look at the data in many ways. We want to make the most of it. But if we're going to look at an array of results, we really need to not be asking, is there something interesting here, but rather asking, how well does it conform with the causal hypothesis in its finer form? So the next part, this is what much of epidemiologic methods does, in fact, is looking for the ways in which, given our interest, how close can we come, given we are doing our research in the real world with real people, with ethical standards, with technical limitations, et cetera, financial limitations, and so on, how close do we get? And I'm listing there the main reasons that we tend to deviate, and I'll use these in the examples, but as familiar as it is, and therefore perhaps boring, this non-random allocation of exposure can be a very big deal for many exposures. When we're looking at the allocation of physical activity, or we're looking at the allocation of, socioeconomic status and so on, there is a very distinct non-randomness to that we simply have to, keep in mind. Losses from study groups, non-participation can be a substantial issue. Limitations in measurement, of course, the ability to assess and approximate what we're really interested in. This is why I often in the hypothesis, not just to say we are interested in, alcohol use, what would we ideally like to know? Well, we'd like to know exactly how much the person has been drinking every day for the last 20 years. We want to know days where it's been a binge of over 5 drinks a day. I think people are sometimes uneasy about being honest about what they would really like to know, because then they have to accept how far it is from checking a box on a questionnaire that says daily. But really, it's acknowledging that kind of fundamental limitation. And then, of course, the one that we're probably most attentive to is sufficient study size. That one we're used to. It can't be too tiny, but and it can be a concern, but it's sort of, I think, the one area where tradition is on the side of examining that. So now we've been through the menu of problems, and we don't want a list of 20 problems. If we have that, we might as well just give up. There better be a small number of very significant limitations. And I find, honestly, it's always under 3 in my experience. That's not like a magical constant of epidemiology, but I think the reality is, if I'm doing a study of physical activity and breast cancer, well, I can tell you what the problem is. It's measuring physical activity, okay? I don't have to be, deeply knowledgeable about that field. Or it's going to be measuring physical activity, and it's going to be selective participation in physical activity, confounding. In other areas, it may be something different that way, but to really zero in on the fundamental limitations. And for those, they become alternate hypotheses. A hypothesis of bias is a very testable hypothesis. If you want to make the hypothesis of bias that the non-random allocation of physical activity is introducing confounding by other risk factors, let's say, well, that's it. Now we've got something we're going to try to zero in on. We're going to look at the study, we're going to analyze the results, and we're going to see what we can glean from that. But it becomes important enough not just to be a mention in the discussion, but something that's worth delving into deeply. And even beyond the study itself, if I say physical activity measurement's a problem, well, we're going to have to go to some other literature out there to know how good or bad it is, because that's very relevant to interpreting this study. And so it's really trying to take to heart the major methodologic concerns and not just sort of say, oh, yeah, I'll apologize in the discussion and recognize it as a limitation. But again, how big of a deal is it? How much of a problem is it? Is something that we're going to need to be accountable for at the end. After we've done all this, we integrate the evidence. We both considering the support indicative of the causal, supportive of the causal hypothesis, and then also the evidence for and against the biases that we've laid out this way. So now we have the whole template of information, and now we've got to say, what does it mean? Okay. And again, as I said, I'm setting the bar high in the spirit of, at least aspirational goals. Informed, integrated, objective judgment regarding a potential causal effect. And the neat thing about this is, when it works, is that when you're saying, what research do we need to do? Well, the priorities for research for epidemiologists are zeroing in on the big limitations, not the trivial ones. We don't want to just keep doing the same thing over and over, but to acknowledge what is holding us back and really going after those issues. For policymakers, and again, we'll have, I hope, discussion of this, those who are more in the policy world, or at least interface with the policy world on the panel, but presenting the information in a form that is useful for the audience, and that can be quite tricky. It's not to say changing the substantive nature of it, but it's presenting it in a way that will provide the input that's needed for doing the kind of cost-benefit evaluation that is done. And then distilling the message, and this is also makes people nervous, understandably, when now you've got a sound bite you can give on the topic. It is not helpful to say, I won't do it. I don't think that's the right answer. Or to, it's really trying to do justice to a complicated situation in a form that is simple enough for the public and the media to make some use of. And again, it's a challenge, recognized, but I think it's part of what it means to interpret evidence. So, the part 3 or whatever it was, I can't remember my own agenda now. But anyway, the slides now is going to be about this one particular theme, one of the examples. And this is concerning cell phones and cancer, specifically brain cancer. And this is actually, it's interesting. I gave part of this in a talk in Norway, and cell phones are a much bigger issue in Europe than the US. People are more worried about them, but it still bubbles up now and then. It's sort of these things seem to have a life course where it seems to be quiet in the US right now. I'm sure something will perk it up again eventually, but basically the concern is that cell phone use may be linked to brain tumors. And it's sort of the origins of it are, of course, anecdotal. That's often the case studies, individuals who use cell phones and got brain cancer. But also, I think, in general, a sort of a distrust of this mysterious new technology, that it's, radio frequency radiation penetrating your brain, understandably makes people a little anxious. And in fact, the proximity of the antenna, for those who still talk and don't just text, which has changed things considerably, you're holding the antenna right next to your head, and that's where the most power is. And I know in talking to biophysicists about this, there can be enough power to elevate temperature a degree or two. Now, that's not a terribly, life-threatening kind of thing, but it is suggesting this is not totally biologically inert. It's not, you can't dismiss it for having no possibility of causing harm. However, as indicated there, there's no established reason to think that that would cause cancer either. So the studies began on this around 2000. They followed a fairly predictable pattern. Most of them were case control studies where people with brain cancer and controls would report their history of exposure and looking for associations and concerns with the literature at that time that I'll say have continued really is the potential for selective participation. Very difficult to have in a case control study where there is public awareness of a hypothesis, the danger of biased reporting of use. Okay. Brain tumor cases, depending on how advanced they are, there can be real cognitive limitations that bear on the quality and accuracy of the self-report. Phone use is loosely and imperfectly related to actual radio frequency radiation exposure. It depends on a lot of different factors, from the design of the phone, how far away the cell tower is. There's a lot of factors that sort of play into that, and so we're kind of remote from the actual measurement of radio frequency. And then, at least in the early studies, even though they were, as I'll describe, largely negative, this question kept coming up, well, wait a while. What's going to happen? Is there a latency here that if we, in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, we will discover we made a terrible mistake? after the fact. And again, there are precedents for that. Recognizing the impact of asbestos required a certain period of time before it could be known. Now, this is a summary of just a couple of, from a review paper we did just prior to the INTERPHONE study. And really, the key dot is here. This is for mobile phone use in glioma, short-term use, any use. And that's what we call null, at least I call null. This is for long-term use, which is over 10 years. And you see the bars are the wider confidence intervals because it was rare when these studies were being done. And these are, again, you probably can't see the dates, but this is from 99 through 2006. Not many people had been using cell phones for 10 years or more. But again, basically, no association had been seen. So that was sort of the set the stage for the INTERPHONE study. And it was had a goal of conducting a very large study of what is fortunately, a fairly rare brain kind of cancer, brain tumors. And with the passage of time, as this was being designed around 2010, I believe, I'll come back to that in a bit, there were more and more people who had used it a long time, and so it was an opportunity to look at longer-term use. The technology keeps changing, not for health issues, but just the advancement of the technology changes steadily and continues to change as they redesign phones. And instead of just asking a few questions, they were going to go for this brute force approach to the questionnaire and ask everything. I've made that mistake myself, but it's tempting to say, well, let's ask just everything that we could possibly imagine being relevant to determining exposure. So they conducted a very large study, 2,700 cases of glioma. Were recruited, interviewed regarding mobile phone use. They had an equal number of matched controls. This was conducted across something like 13 countries, mostly in Europe, a few in other parts of the world. And they, again, followed a classic case control design of a very carefully constructed questionnaire addressing history of mobile phone use. So in examining what are the aspects of exposure that were of interest, I won't read through these, you can see them all, but basically there are different ways of conceptualizing exposure. None of these, of course, are directly asking at the radio frequency radiation absorbed by the brain. That would be perhaps the gold standard, but there are different ways of trying to capture degree or intensity of use. Time since start of use is trying to address the issue of latency, number of calls, call time, the side of the head that the phone is habitually used on, which again, it used to seem that was utterly straightforward, but I'll come back to this. It's not so straightforward. People are not as habitual as you think they are. Then they started to look at some of the more precise anatomic refinements of the lobe of the brain, as I'll describe. And then, of course, this was a period, for those of you who are old enough to remember these car phone things where they had these very big, elaborate devices where you didn't hold it by your ear anymore. And of course, this predates texting, which, as I said, has changed everything. So anyway, this is in an era where people really use their cell phones. They like to talk on them. Now, I'm going to summarize literally books full of results, okay, in a slide. That's what is necessary, and I sometimes think there's diminishing returns from going a lot further. But at any rate, overall, any use of cell phones was weakly but inversely associated with risk of glioma, so that the odds ratio was 0.8, as you see in a study of this size, very, very tight confidence interval. And so that there was a small reduction in risk associated with use of cell phones. No association whatsoever with duration of use, time since first use, or number of calls. In looking at cumulative call time, they had a large enough study that they looked in deciles of exposure, and the first 9 deciles were completely null. And in the uppermost decile, this association was observed. And as we'll come back to, that became the focus of interpretation. What does that thing mean, and what do we make of it? And interestingly, it was only in users of less than 5 years. So the group that was showing the increased risk are recent intense users, not long-term, not overall, but recent intense users, where they had a very large and very imprecise elevation in risk, nearly 5-fold. So now working backwards, what was the causal hypothesis? And as I said, I think it's that increased radio frequency radiation exposure is associated with brain cancer. The research had really been focused. They studied both glioma and meningioma, which is another form of cancer of the meninges of the brain. But really the research had been focused primarily on glioma. And this is where they weren't maybe explicit, but the presumption is that the concern is with cumulative exposure with a long latency. That's when we're looking for carcinogens of a solid, for solid tumors, that's what you would normally be looking for and what you would expect and where you would expect if there's a problem there to see it. Now the primary limitations, again, the obvious one, self-reported history of mobile phone use allows for substantial error. This is, to summarize and integrate behaviors over years and years of the past is not easy, whether it's diet or activity or phone use. Second concern is non-response, because it had to be introduced as a study of mobile phones, and you can imagine the motivations to participate. It's always a problem in case control studies, but the motivation to participate differs quite a bit between cases and controls. Cases have or have had a life-threatening illness and have a different mindset, if you will, than those who are just living their lives happily, and somebody gives them a call one day and says, "Can we interview you about these kinds of issues?" And so there's the non-participation and also potentially differential non-participation. Now, less plausible concerns, just to be a little bit more exhaustive, random error is not a problem here. Okay, whatever problems we have, that's normally on the list. I don't think we need to worry about that one. And interestingly, you could say it's because of ignorance, but the fact is that we know so little about the causes of glioma that there's really not a lot of speculation about confounding. It's not strongly related to anything. Socioeconomic status, it's related to sex, but that's easy enough to obviously control. Age, well, we can handle that. But really, it's not really very much of a lifestyle-related disease, and so if we're going to devote our energy to scrutinizing the results, I'm sort of just illustrating, you do this bit of a triage of what do we really want to zero in on here. So again, now in integrating the causal hypothesis with the pattern of results, I thought the neat studies that was done from this is they actually looked at the location in the brain relative to where the radio frequency radiation from a phone goes. It doesn't penetrate very deeply. And there was no indication that the parts of the brain with greater exposure were at elevated risk. Okay, so that's relevant there in terms of the radio frequency hypothesis. The side of the phone use gave very mixed results, but again, there's all kinds of problems because an early symptoms of the brain tumor may lead the person to change the side of the phone, the head that they're using it on. And as I said, it's not as habitual as you might think, and it really did not give a lot of useful information. We expect more exposure to be associated with greater risk, and that was really not the case here. And we expect, as I said, a longer latency and a longer overall duration of use to be associated with increased risk, which was not observed here. Now, for exposure misclassification, there are a number of reasons that, as I said, the cases and the controls are really quite different in terms of the quality of the data. Proxy respondents were used in many cases for the cases. More missing data. There were some lower quality interviews. And one of the big questions is in the reporting process whether there is a differential error in terms of the cases being inclined to over-report exposure. That's a very specific kind of question that comes up here. And in the validation study, they did show there was a lot of random error overall. They did a pretty detailed effort to sort of assess that. As indicated there, they underestimated the number of calls on average, overestimated duration of calls. In that sub-study, in the validation study, they did not find evidence of differential reporting. However, in the main study, it was interesting. They found that there was evidence that the cases tend to overreport in the 3 to 5 years before diagnosis. And one of the ways they saw that is they looked at extreme values, whereas indicated there the number of people reporting over 5 hours of use a day, which is hard to imagine, and then the number of people reporting over 12 hours of use a day, which is almost inconceivable. 10 cases and no controls reported that. Now, eliminating those individuals did not change the results a lot, but it provides a bit of circumstantial evidence to suggest that cases may overreport more generally. It certainly adds a bit of empirical evidence that that is the case. For non-response, I won't, again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but there was a rather substantial non-response. This is, the state of the art of case control studies. One of the reasons they've fallen out of favor is it's very hard to get a good response. And they had, as indicated there, something a little over half of the cases were willing and something around half of the controls, which is not great. Those who did not use mobile phones, they did a validation study and were less likely to participate, not surprisingly. And it accounts for much, if not all, of the inverse association found. Not fully, but pretty close to it, that just simply the pattern of non-response generated this odds ratio of 0.8. So what do we do with this story? Again, this is now we're into my interpretation of this constellation of studies. I'm not alone in this, but it's not unanimous. Pattern of results does not support a causal hypothesis other than this one glimmer that needs to be at least considered in the uppermost decile of use. There's evidence suggesting that cases overreport, that is a very plausible, probably the leading contender in my view for explaining why that association was found. Non-response probably explains the reduced risk. And interestingly, they found a very similar pattern for meningioma, which has a very different constellation of risk factors and causes, which to me at least adds to the evidence that there may be something more likely to be biased than having the same exposure cause the same peculiar pattern for two rather different diseases. So for policy, if somebody asked me, and people would, maybe not for policy, the media asked me, what do you think of this? I thought it was good news. I saw this. This is very reassuring. We seem to love the technology. I would be delighted to find that it isn't a major threat. So large, well-designed, carefully conducted study found little or no support for risk of brain cancer. Really does not really support any kind of regulatory action based on this kind of issue. And I said, again, depending on how much I have to distill it, it's overall reassuring. For research, it's kind of interesting because this still comes up. I don't think it's worth probably doing this again in the same form. It was a $25 million study, 10 years of effort. All that we gain with the passage of time is we have now people who are exposed for 20 years instead of 10 years. And of course, we can study the technologies that have come online since the last study was done. But it's a very big investment for kind of a long shot. And there are other ways of doing surveillance that I could talk about. I won't spend the time now. But there are other ways of keeping an eye on things, largely just by monitoring the incidence of brain tumors. Maybe a much more efficient approach that way. If I was going to go design a new study, if I was going to write to NIH or the EPA or whoever and try to convince them to fund a new study, I think the only way that would be there would be any enthusiasm for it from me or from the reviewers would be if we could refine exposure assessment. The inherent limitations of self-report, no matter how elegant the questionnaire, how big the study, it's not going to get much better. If there are ways of using records of use or ways of actually assessing radiofrequency exposure, we might be onto something, and it could be a much more refined test of the hypothesis. And especially if it was a passive ascertainment method of looking at records and so on, it might overcome the non-response issue as well. But it sort of is one of those areas, it's not unusual, where sort of epidemiology butts up against the limited technology, and the research ends not because we've got it nailed down, all questions are resolved, or everybody's happy. It's honestly that we just don't know how to make any more progress. So. Anyway, I'll go on to the example 2 here. Caffeine and miscarriage, totally switching gears very dramatically. It's a long-standing question, and one that is asked, still pops up in the media, periodically. Does caffeine exposure in early pregnancy cause an increased risk of miscarriage, of fetal loss? And there's a rather large volume of studies. I've contributed some of my own, a large volume of studies, and there's a lot of public interest. This is like the former question, really. This is generated, the motivation for the research is largely the public concern. It's a common and discretionary exposure. Miscarriage is a very common problem. And pregnancy itself is a time of heightened health concern. There's a greater degree of focus, I think, perhaps, than there is on certainly adult health. It's got a certain importance of its own. So the idea of concern, the causal hypothesis, is that elevated exposure to caffeine between conception, so it's exposure to the fetus. It's not preconceptionally, it's exposure to the fetus during gestation is the time window of concern. It's thought to be potentially toxic to otherwise healthy fetuses. A number of miscarriages are due to karyotypic, major genetic abnormalities. This is not relevant to those. Those have other issues. This is relevant to the subset that is otherwise healthy. And one would presume that higher dose will predict higher risk. The more you have, the greater the risk will be. And also one would presume that it doesn't matter whether you're getting the caffeine from coffee or tea, or if it is about caffeine, that's what it's about. You could have a separate hypothesis, which is totally different, that it's coffee and something else in coffee. But the focus here is really on caffeine. So the challenges, and these are quite substantial here. The timing of fetal loss is unknown, and I'll come back to this. But basically, during early pregnancy, which is when most miscarriages occur, it is not always clear when the fetus is no longer viable. And the recognition is delayed by days to weeks from when the loss, the demise occurs until the recognition occurs. And that, as I'll describe, makes it problematic to study. Nausea is a very common symptom of early pregnancy, and it is very strongly, as I'll present, it's a very strongly favorable prognostic factor for the health of pregnancy. So again, this is the good news part for those who go through and are throwing up and feeling awful. Everything's going great. Everything, you may be miserable, but everything's going well in there. And it influences potentially caffeine intake. Nausea may be counter to intake, the intake of caffeine. Caffeine use is associated with other behaviors, as you'd expect. And, of course, the usual imperfect assessment of how much caffeine people are taking in. Not just self-report, but there's tremendous variability. When you say, I have a cup of coffee, it's like a 2- or 3-fold range of what that actually means in terms of the caffeine. So now going in, what is the real causal hypothesis here? So timing of exposure should be during the early fetal development. So association should be stronger for use in early pregnancy than before pregnancy, because that's the relevant window. Given the overall decline in caffeine use during pregnancy, and this gets a little bit convoluted, expect those who are having an unhealthy pregnancy in one form or another, who are not experiencing nausea, will decrease their caffeine less. And I'll show you a graph in a bit that makes that maybe a little bit clearer. Well, here it is. So the idea is that, and this is from a study done in Sweden, Natinges and colleagues, but this is first looking at caffeine intake over the course of pregnancy. The case patients, those who had miscarriages, are there. Those who had healthy pregnancies continuing are the dotted lines. They all start off fairly high, and those who have healthy pregnancies decline more in their caffeine use than those who go on to have miscarriages. So it's a complicated picture there. And conversely, nausea picks up rather dramatically and is much worse in those who have healthy pregnancies than those who have miscarriages. So we've got a challenge here. That maybe is the bottom line. It's not easy to sort this out. Under the causal hypothesis, as I said, you would expect normal fetuses to be more at risk than genetically abnormal fetuses, and there's very limited data to address this. So this is a couple of studies suggesting that the associations are similar across different types, but in a sense, karyotypically abnormal fetuses can be sort of a control because caffeine shouldn't affect them, and if we're still seeing a pattern, something is not right. It just is not very definitive data. Now, the question of dose response is something that's always interesting, and here we've got this is from 2 different meta-analyses done in different ways, and whether you look as a continuous measure for risk per 150 milligrams per day, there is a rather consistent indication of a positive dose response gradient. So that across quite a few studies, as you can, when you look at these confidence intervals, you can see that's quite a few studies. Now, the big problem here is the confounding or reverse causation by nausea. So as I said, nausea is common in early pregnancy. Early nausea is associated with lower caffeine intake and predictive of miscarriage, which would be confounding. But the nausea or the cessation of nausea can actually mean that the fetus has already been lost. So now we actually have reverse causality. Having the bad outcome increases the exposure temporally, if you think of it that way. And that's an unusual kind of challenge because basically we didn't know they had the bad outcome, and that's why we're making the mistake. So again, I won't go into detail on this, but this is not a small association. This is rare to see. 4- to 5-fold increased risk for extreme nausea, in inverse association, so that those with extreme nausea are 4- to 5-fold less likely to have a miscarriage than those without nausea. So this is a very powerful association, and for those who are interested, just really it's thought to be a marker of the hormonal environment sort of doing what it's supposed to do, probabilistically. So nausea and caffeine consumption. As I said, as the figure showed, regardless of nausea or no nausea, people reduce their caffeine intake. There's actually very little evidence that nausea itself, as self-reported, is associated with greater reduction in caffeine, not part of the nice story that one might expect. But then there's this sort of vagueness of, well, why do people quit drinking coffee? Are they concerned? Are they subtly just not inclined anymore? Or are they actively nauseous? It's hard to know, but there is that pattern of declining caffeine during pregnancy. Nausea during pregnancy, again, adjusting for nausea is not going to solve the problem, although there's very little impact of adjustment that way. And it's really very, as I said, not to get too deep into the weeds here, but it's very challenging to sort this out with the data that we typically have available. Even if we take nausea into account, it doesn't lead to a definitive assessment. I mentioned caffeine exposure should be relevant regardless of diet, and there was an interesting study done that looked at medications with caffeine. So we get the whole coffee nausea picture out of it. Or those with genetic variation. This is when they use that term Mendelian randomization. The idea is look for genetic variation that simulates different exposures, but it's not subject to the same confounding. Very little research so far, but it doesn't generally support there being an association with caffeine. Other health behaviors, as I mentioned, are of concern. There is some correlation with smoking and other types of lifestyle factors. But in fact, those other factors have very little impact on miscarriage, so they're not very likely suspects that way. Again, even smoking is marginally related to risk of miscarriage. And of course, everybody adjusts for smoking anyway, and that's an unlikely explanation. So looking at the overall story, there is a clear dose-response gradient, which is undeniable from the literature. I can't say that it's been demonstrated to be conclusively due to bias, but it certainly might well. There's a very strong association of nausea with successful pregnancy, and the way I would sort of summarize that is it limits our ability to really address the nuances of caffeine, nausea, and miscarriage in early pregnancy. And as I said, it doesn't allow for a definitive either assessment of the causal hypothesis or the hypothesized bias, but it does limit the epidemiologic research that's been done so far. If I had to make an inference, and I was trying to explain this to others, I would say that it's quite plausible that the observed associations really are due to confounding or reverse causality. In other words, it's sort of the weight of evidence, and it's a judgment that others may make differently, but that's the way I would tend to tilt it. Now, interpreting it gives a little bit of a different story here. If we're looking for ways to reduce miscarriage, I don't think reducing caffeine intake is really a winner there. I don't think that's a good strategy to discourage coffee and tax it and worry people about it. I don't think it's going to have much of an impact. Interestingly, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists tells clinicians what to advise their patients, and they concede that high but not low levels are associated with increased risk, which is factually untrue, by the way. It's a dose-response gradient, but that's a convenient story. It's not exactly true, an acceptable goal. So don't worry people if they're only having a cup. If they're having 10 cups, then maybe you get them to cut back, so not bad. And again, in terms of individual advice, it's unclear if there's any effect, but given there's no known benefit, basically it's pretty simple. If you're concerned, then you can reduce or eliminate it, and certainly it will do no harm. It may not, I don't want to guarantee it's going to do a lot of good, but it's interesting because it gets into that, as I said, the ACOG recommendations I found interesting because it's right in spirit, it's just wrong in fact. So. Again, if I'm going forward on this area, and this is an area much more that I would love to be doing more research on, I don't think we need to do more studies that show an association. Unless we can refine our knowledge of the timing of loss, unless we have some way to monitor that and combine it with caffeine use over time, we're just not going to get much further. The only other way is to study caffeine independent of the usual issues of looking at coffee through these measures of genetic variation or drugs or some other type of exposure that results in caffeine exposure. So, take-home messages here from both illustrations. Causal hypothesis predicts a pattern of results, not a single measure of association. It drives me crazy when people will look at 5 different studies that have completely different results, and they'll say, oh, they're quite consistent. Each one shows something's going on. Oh, it's a very nice story. Well, different exposures, different time periods, different subsets of the outcome, different age groups, but they all show something going on. That's not replication. The specific features need to be guided. It's not just randomly choosing what you're going to declare to be the interesting hypothesis, not to be overconfident about it, but to at least recognize that there are theories and general senses of mechanisms that need to be taken into account. And so, as I said there, you can think of it conceptually, if you want to put it in more formal statistical terms, that tailoring the hypothesis, sort of retrofitting the hypothesis to the data, which people do all the time, that's how people get papers published with P of 0.05 in many cases, is misleading, and it's not, it doesn't advance things. I mean, it may advance your career, but it doesn't advance the literature. In focusing on bias, a small number of scenarios, this takes work to actually dig into these, which is why I've been going maybe on too long, but it takes work to delve into the bias hypothesis, and very frequently produces mixed evidence, but it's a thread or a line of evidence that will have bearing on the final interpretation of what does it all mean. So for researchers, as I said, if I'm going to design a new study, I want to shift the weight of evidence. As I mentioned to somebody before, I don't want to spend, several $1 million and 5 years of my life and put another dot on somebody's meta-analysis. And that is, a lot of research does that. It's very, okay, here's another study of this. It's really very unlikely to have impact. It's only going to add precision at best. And I think that increasingly when you're making the case, you've got to go after the big problems. You've got to say, this has been a limiting factor in the research and we've got a way around it, or we've got a population that addresses it. And so that at the end of that study, either the causal hypothesis will become notably more likely, or, and it's just as valuable in many cases, a substantial and leading bias hypothesis will become more or less likely. That is just as informative in informing the overall literature. If I could show in the caffeine story and do a really good study that shows that what nausea does and how it affects caffeine and how that affects the measures, that would be that would be quite informative for judging the overall literature. So in presenting, and when this talk was announced, a colleague, Steve Cole at UNC, said he wrote me, it was his whole email message to me that was the title there, "What is epidemiologic wisdom?" So this is, what do I mean? How dare I? He's joking, and it was good-natured, but it's a fair question. And so I'm going to close with my sort of definition of it. Again, command of the critical epidemiologic principles and methods, and so that you can go through the vast knowledge we've acquired and select the most relevant issues. The choice of those is informed by the substantive problem. It isn't just, I'm always going to invoke confounding no matter what. Well, you've got to tailor it to what the nature of the problem is, and considering both the quantitative and qualitative aspects of the problem. The second part, of course, is this deep subject matter knowledge, which is something that, again, it's been emphasized, I suppose, forever, but I've come to more and more appreciate how important it is to work with people who have really deep subject matter knowledge. If you're going to study air pollution, you're not working with people who know about the chemistry and physics and monitoring of air pollution. You're just winging it as an epidemiologist, which some of us like to do. You're going to miss out. It's true on the exposure side, and it's true very much on the disease side. I always am working with clinicians now who know both clinically and biomedically what's going on, because that's part of the substantive, that's how we make our judgments. Full understanding of the etiologic process, and then we can evaluate what it all means. And then finally, this business, and again, as I said, it's one that I've not focused as much on, is how do we use this and address the needs of the target audience? And part of it is not lamenting, this is, epidemiologists are, as capable of this kind of presumptuousness as anybody, not lamenting, oh, the media doesn't want to get it right. Well, the media is doing their job, and it may not be the same job as us. We wish if they just understood probability, it would be so much easier. Well, they don't. So, it's sort of like taking ownership. Well, maybe that means we have to present the results a little differently. Maybe it means even the choice of research. Working with some colleagues, kind of interesting in addressing the issue of just interfacing with the public, who is so frustrated with conflicting stories and ambiguous evidence, and really trying to ask the question, is there research and a way to present it that they would find more helpful? That they are the target audience, so it's sort of accepting that. I think that, and this gets into sort of dangerous territory, but I think that acknowledging as we're communicating this information, recognizing that it's in a context of other considerations, whether it's communicating to policymakers who, and not being so presumptuous to think that epidemiology is the only story or the dominating story, that may not be the case. It's just part of the story. Again, providing as much detail as can be understood and used. And again, seeking objectivity, but distilling the information beyond what the sort of in a technical narrow sense, beyond what's easily supported. You're getting into realms now where you may do it a little differently than a colleague, and that's okay. But if you're a thoughtful, objective, and reasonably informed person, you need, I think, to be more willing to put that out there and not simply say, results are inconclusive. So anyway, thank you very much.